St. Louis de Montfort had always wanted to be a martyr to the faith. He had often dreamed of dying gladly for Christ from an Iroquois tomahawk or a Zulu spear. Now he had important things to do for God, and the sight of these puppy assassins infuriated him. So this is in Wisdom's Fool. There's this description of this gang of young intellectual ruffians that take aim on St. Louis de Montfort. So he responds, he let his fury snap its leash. He exploded. He fell on the dozen or so like a destroying angel. He had no wings. He didn't need them. His feet and his fists were better than wings for offense and defense. And then suddenly protectors stream out from everywhere, and St. Louis suddenly has to start protecting the gang from his own protectors. All the people defending him started destroying this gang of ruffians. So this is The Greats Podcast. I'm Scott Smith, and I'm finally getting to St. Louis de Montfort. This is a saint that's I feel very close to. Like 10 years ago now, almost 10 years ago, for our Men of the Immaculata conference, I did a new translation of St. Louis de Montfort's Total Consecration to Jesus through Mary, which is a book that's really resounded through my life for these past 10 years. And a lot of fruits have come from that Marian consecration, but also from St. Louis himself. I'm even hosting a pilgrimage next year to all the different sites we're going to talk about in St. Louis de Montfort's life. I was recently called up to speak on the Conor Gallagher show about St. Louis de Montfort as an expert on St. Louis de Montfort. And that's kind of startling to me that anyone would consider me an expert on St. Louis de Montfort, but if you have to be an expert about somebody, and I'm not saying I am, St. Louis de Montfort is a great one. So I've read his letters, his works, True Devotion, Secret of the Rosary, Total Consecration. I've read some of them in great depth. The book I'll be talking about today is not so much about his devotion to the Blessed Mother. It's this biography of him called Wisdom's Fool. And I might also talk about the letters as well. I've read this book quite a few times in preparation, and part of it was to prepare for being an expert on St. Louis de Montfort. So I'm going to distill out for you what I think are the coolest moments in this book. So stay tuned. That's what we'll do. So St. Louis de Montfort, give you kind of an overview of his life, the importance of his life. St. Louis de Montfort's going to be teaching basically Catholic fundamentals to France in the 1700s. France at this time is overrun by Jansenism. Jansenism is this really rigorous approach to the faith that receives the Eucharist very rarely and only if you're in like not just having gone to confession, but you're in like this perfected state, like maybe you've fasted for a week. Like it's very rigorous, and it's all rigorous because you're basically trying to save yourself through good works. In the midst of this comes St. Louis de Montfort, and he talks about the path to Jesus, the surest, safest, easiest, most secure path to Jesus being the Blessed Mother. And instead of making this overly rigorous path to Jesus, using the Blessed Mother in her motherly way to make a simple path. And so it's a huge counterpoint. He's going to be blasted out of basically every diocese he goes into. The church at this time in France is rough, especially where he is. They've also have not only the heresy of Jansenism, but Gallicanism. But he is going to have such a lasting effect on everywhere where he becomes a missionary within France. The Pope St. Louis de Montfort wanted to be a missionary to the Americas, like I said in the opening, to die from a Iroquois tomahawk or Zulu spear. But the Pope said, no, you have plenty to do missionary-wise in your own country of France. So that's what he did. And mostly is the northwestern section of France, Brittany. One of those sections of France that he is going to reconvert to the faith is the Vendée. The Vendée is going to be, even though overlooked in our modern times, I think often, is going to be this hugely important region of France following the French Revolution. The French Revolution was completely anti-church. We're often taught the French Revolution was this great victory for fraternity, equality, the way it's described in Les Miserables, which is not how Victor Hugo intended, is, this song of the barricades, but that was even the French Revolution the original French Revolution, 1789, was just, that they massacred priests and true Catholics by the thousands. The guillotine wasn't fast enough to kill priests, so they would fill barges with priests in the middle of the Seine River and sink it to kill them off faster. It is just a horrible period of devastation of civilization. And at the head of a lot of this were the Freemasons, who were anti-church. And the Vendée region is going to be the one region of France to really stand against this, and they're going to become an army of martyrs. So they only did that. And even the symbol of the Vendée region, the Sacred Heart with a cross over it, that was partially designed by St. Louis de Montfort. None of that would have happened without St. Louis de Montfort. So even though this happened 100 years after his death, he saved France by inspiring the Vendée. And his greatest work, Total Consecration to Jesus through Mary, he said would either be ravaged by the coming hordes. He spoke prophetically about the coming French Revolution, or it would be buried and unseen for 100 years or more, and that's exactly what happened. His writings weren't recovered until they're found in a box by some Montfortian fathers, right, from the order he started over 100 years after his death. So, very interesting life, very impactful life, still to this day with the Marian consecration and true devotion. We'll see if this is mostly trying to be a biographical podcast, but there's so much good to talk about in true devotion. So we'll see if we get into some of that or connect to it. So this is how Wisdom's Fool starts out in chapter 1. They talk about how St. Louis de Montfort wanted every man, woman, and child to be a slave of Mary, which it's kind of crazy to think about the goodness of slavery, but slavery in first century Israel in Roman times was different than the chattel slavery that we had preceding the Civil War in the Americas, where a person was property. The kind of slavery, Roman slavery, was you rose and fell with the person to whom you're enslaved to, and they were supposed to educate you and take care of you and secure you, and all their merits were your merits. So that's why we want to be a slave of Mary, as St. Louis de Montfort talks about. Even Mary, when she says, I'm the handmaiden of the Lord, the word there is doulon or doulos, which is slave. I am the slave of the Lord. We want to be a slave of Mary because, in the particular judgment, all of her merits, when Jesus looks upon us, he'll see all of her merits, not all of our not merits. So that's the idea. And that, so the introduction to Wisdom's Fool, this biography of St. Louis de Montfort, talks about how he wants us all to be a slave of Jesus in Mary, to wear chains in token of that slavery and to say the rosary every day. You might hear, I feel like this is going to be rattling. I don't know if the mic's going to pick this up, but I've got my chain that I wear for the Marian consecration. And it's got the miraculous medal on it, so it sometimes rattles against the glass top of my desk. St. Louis de Montfort believed that if you could put a rosary around a sinner's neck, the fellow would never get away. Speaking of the chains, he believed that if you say the rosary faithfully every day until your death, you'll receive an eternal crown of glory in spite of your sins. To him, the rosary was the book of wisdom, translated into beads of wood or bone or glass, which even a blind man could read. Christians should prize it as a duchess prizes her necklace of fine pearls. So St. Louis de Montfort, there are 3 churches of his youth where he was born in Montfort. He took the name of his town, shedding the name of his family name, Grignon. It was a bit of a noble name, and he, out of humility, wanted to shed that. There was one of the churches of his birth, St. Nicholas, had a particular attraction for him because of a duck. There's a duck that had been carved into the reredos of this church. That's the altarpiece. He felt, when he'd look at this as a boy, he felt mysteriously close to heaven because he was told that no ordinary man had left that mark. And there was this carving was commemorating a miracle St. Nicholas had worked to protect a maiden in grave danger. Some had said that a group of rude soldiers had threatened her, which is interesting because, like I just described at the beginning, there were sometimes gangs of guys that would attack St. Louis. There's no real connection how the duck was connected to this miracle of St. Nicholas. Did he thrust a flock of ducks, spitting, scolding, nagging, nipping, wing-beating wild geese between the lass and the men who tried to seduce her or menace her? Don't know. But there is what would happen. There was a legend that would happen every year, even during St. Louis's life, that a mother duck would lead her ducklings in procession, right? If you've ever seen a group of ducks, and if I look out my window, I can see our little flock of ducks. They walk in procession, just like the priests and deacons and altar servers do coming in and out of Mass. They walk in a perfect line, bill to tail, tail to bill. So they look like a natural procession. And so this mother duck would lead her ducklings, her brood of ducklings every year, or a mother duck, maybe not the same one, would lead her ducklings through the church every year up to the main aisle, and she would leave one duckling on the altar. And then she would disappear until the next year, and she'd reappear again. And so I think what's happening here and how this is ultimately going to speak to St. Louis de Montfort is it's the mother duck leading her children to Jesus, to the altar. This motherly leading, making a secure path for her ducklings, and we're Mary's ducklings. And she'd leave one at the altar. That could have been even, St. Louis might have felt like that was him, that was left on the altar as a priest. So it's an image, this line of ducklings is like an image of the total consecration. So the Grignons, they're noble. This was St. Louis Grignon de Montfort. St. Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort. That's his full name. But we know him as St. Louis de Montfort or St. Louis Marie de Montfort. But the Grignons, like I said, they were somewhat noble and an interesting family. They had the right to wear swords when they were going anywhere because of their class. St. Louis didn't want to wear a sword. He didn't want to have a distinguished name. He wanted to be a nobody. So eventually he decided to call himself just St. Louis of Montfort. His father was like some kind of notary or lawyer. And so they lived on a big two-story house on the street of the men of the law. That structure is still standing, or at least it was at the time of Wisdom's Fool. Hopefully, and I'll provide the link if you want to go on this St. Louis de Montfort pilgrimage with me. Hopefully we'll see that house. But ultimately, St. Louis de Montfort's father was not a real successful lawyer, so they moved out to the country. When he was about 2 or 3 years old, he bought a farm at Le Bois Marquier, a league or so from Montfort in the parish of Saint Eloy, in the village of Effendic. There, St. Louis was able to serve the Mass every morning. Well, another interesting thing, St. Louis de Montfort, even though he wasn't the oldest child, he's the oldest surviving child of 18. There's a family of 18. His father often had a temper, and there was a family known for their tempers, a family of kind of bear-like people that would lead armies and just destroy people in battle. So this father and his wrath versus St. Louis and his wrath would often have difficulties. His own mother, St. Louis' own mother, was pretty preoccupied, right? Wasn't able to show him a whole lot of affection because he was the eldest of 18 kids. So he was expected to be helping his mother with the children, and his mother had lots of other ducklings, so to speak, that needed her affection. So he didn't really get a lot of affection from his mothers. From his earliest years, he had special devotion to Our Lady. He was adopted, in a sense, by the Blessed Mother. He was enraptured by her pictures and statues. He'd often be seen praying for an hour or more on his knees before her image, even as a child. He was special from the beginning, that he'd be of such warrior fighting stock, pugnacious people, but at the same time, like so devoted to the Blessed Mother, like a dove. Very interesting combination of traits that will ultimately serve him very well as a missionary. He had an uncle who was a priest in Rennes, another city of France, not far from Montfort. His uncle, Father Robert, and he tutored St. Louis before he began his formal education at the age of 9, and St. Louis is going to prove himself to be very smart, very fast. He's going to start college at the age of 12 with the Jesuits in Rennes. He's considered a genius, and he'd even teach his siblings, his brothers, when he'd come home. He would always carry a statue, which he carved himself, of Mary, and it's thought to have been inspired by the statue of Our Lady in the Carmelite Church of Saint-Sulpice, where his uncle served as priest. And the original statue that he carved this from was lots of legends and miracles were attached to it. Wives, mothers, sweethearts had flocked to it during the terrible months of 1356 and 1357 when the English siege threatened massacre, starvation of Rennes and the whole nation of France. And the statue was later venerated after it was saved by a great hero. That guy's name was Du Guesclin. For the hundreds of years following, lots of miracles were attached to the statue. In 1675, the statue was a great inspiration, and that's when St. Louis de Montfort would have come upon it. Spent hours on his knees every day before that statue, visiting it twice a day, going to college and coming home. So even though St. Louis de Montfort was more than able to take care of himself, he was often bullied because he was so unlike the other kids, so precocious. They would pour dirty water into the pockets of his new jacket, and he only smiled and forgave them. They tripped him. They did not curse. They slapped and kicked him. They did not strike back. He ended up spending more time with his Jesuit teachers than with his fellow students. Father Descartes introduced St. Louis to Father Bellier, who was the almoner, whatever, I don't know what that means, of the city's general hospital. I think it's some kind of chaplain. And so he became one of this priest's bands of helpers, where he visited the poor, begged clothing and food, pray for the dying, and even sit with the dying. Louis discovered in this rich city that people were more desperate, more ignorant, more needy than Montfort. And he did all this while still remaining at the head of his class. So eventually, St. Louis de Montfort is going to get to go to seminary. This time in France, if you're a rich kid, you got to go to the nice seminary. If you're a poor kid, you got to go to the not as nice seminary. But if you're a poor kid who found a patron, you could go to the major seminary of Saint-Sulpice. He's ultimately going to end up there. He did find a patron, Mademoiselle de Montigny. She ran out of money, unfortunately. So he ends up, and this, you can see this is where he's ultimately headed. It's important for him to get there because it's the model of all seminaries in the world, the greatest seminary. It's founded by the friend of many saints, Father Jean-Jacques Oyer, and it was the House of Mary. Father Oyer did nothing without consulting Mary. He went to Jesus only through Mary. So you're going to see, like, this is the origins, the germ of the true devotion, total consecration that St. Louis de Montfort's going to take to new heights. This is where he's going to connect with it. Father Oyer lived and died for Jesus and Mary. He was a slave of Mary, or rather Jesus and Mary. So this is St. Louis de Montfort's just going to be building on what Father Oyer had created, or what he had discovered spiritually. And Father Oyer was taught by St. Francis de Sales. St. John Baptist de La Salle was one of his students. St. Vincent de Paul was his friend, and was with Father Oyer at his death, and even St. Vincent de Paul believed Father Oyer to be a saint. So quite a fine pedigree for Father Oyer. So we're just waiting for St. Louis de Montfort to connect with the seminary founded by this guy. So St. Louis is going to walk from Rennes to Paris. It's kind of a hike. It's going to take him 10 days. This is going to be something we're going to see throughout his life, that he is going to be walking everywhere. He's going to eventually walk to Rome, which is much further, and connect with the Pope. He is going to sleep on stones or maybe a little bit of hay in a hay loft, but he's going to just be this severe ascetic, and it's just going to be, it's not going to be any big deal to him. He's going to be so accustomed to this sort of privations and deprivations for the Blessed Mother. But this time he's going to reach Paris. He's going to be soaked, smeared, rumpled, unshaven, with a big, scraggly black beard, only wood smoke, wet straw, and pungent stables. So he's going to, when he gets to the door of Saint-Sulpice, he's going to look kind of funny. So when Mademoiselle de Montigny's funds dry up, Louis' spiritual director, Father de la Barmondière, who becomes his Barmondier becomes his spiritual director after Father Descartes, after he's passed on from Father Descartes. And Le Barmondier was a founder of a small community where Louis spent his time at Saint-Sulpice because it provided him free room and board, which he wouldn't have been able to afford without that. Once his patroness, José de Montaigny, was unable to help him anymore. And the way that he earned his room and board at this little community founded by de la Barmondier was by staying up with the dead as they died, which just was a pivotal corporal work of mercy that St. Louis de Montfort's going to get to experience again and again and again. Father de la Barmondier would say to St. Louis de Montfort, if the living can't help you, your patroness can't support you, the dead will. You would stay up with the corpse, so to speak. And in Paris at this time, it was a profitable thing to do, to stay up with, you'd be paid to stay up with the dying. So Louis spent most of his nights on his knees in palaces and hovels and middle-class homes, keeping vigil over nobles, tradesmen, beggars, thieves, over imperious beauties, notorious flirts, great artists, great sinners. He loved them all, for Christ had dwelt in them, and in their quiet way they repaid his kindness. They taught him many things. They put ideas into his mind and made him write them in rhyme and meter. St. Louis de Montfort he wrote thousands of songs in his life, mostly to catechize. They found that as a very effective way to catechize. I think this is a poem he wrote. Nature's law will be maintained. Vanity ere your funeral bell. You will be horror and a putrid smell. So I don't know if he meant for all of his poetry to be read. And just before St. Louis to receive minor orders, Barmondier, it's beautiful how St. Louis just makes himself completely dependent on God's will. He writes home that he honestly doesn't know what happens next. He doesn't have lodging anymore, doesn't have the funds to stay in seminary, because the community that Barmondier had established to stay up with the dying, that disintegrated as soon as he died. So now what is St. Louis to do? So the Hotel Dieu, the Hotel God, is his next home. It's the only hospital available in this area, and it's little better than a butcher shop and less clean, but it's a hospital. His lodging is going to be in this little seminary now, where everybody would take turns cooking. This is Father Boucher's little seminary, and the food was so bad it forced him into a hospital, and it was thought he was even going to die because they were bleeding him, as was the medical tradition at the time, and it was really unclean. It's a miracle he didn't die of an infection, but it's similar to his stay in the hospital. He was already converted, but it's similar to St. Ignatius of Loyola's convalescence after his leg had been blown into splinters by a cannonball at the Battle of Pamplona. So he has this time to read and to pray without being constantly active. The nuns and the nurses were fond of him. They waited on him night and day. They talked to him, told him stories. They said the rosary with him, brought him books. Through these women, he encountered the letters of Father Surin, a Jesuit, a book full of glorious thoughts about the folly of the cross. Lying in bed reading Father Surin, Louis had his first dreams of spreading devotion to wisdom, to the cross, to Jesus and Mary, and to Mary herself, the mother and queen of all mankind. Through these nuns and nurses, Louis also met two women who insisted on becoming his new patronesses. So terrible food puts him in the hospital, doesn't know what's going to happen, and by being poisoned by bad food, he encounters his new patronesses. So God takes care of him. So he's able to enter the little seminary of Saint-Sulpice. It wasn't the grand seminary. Still can afford those fees, or the beds were softer, the food was better, more appetizing, but he had never been as happy. So the little seminary of Saint-Sulpice, Father Brenier, the superior of the little seminary of Saint-Sulpice, and Father Bouin, his associate, had heard stories through probably the nurses of St. Louis' sanctity. The nuns and nurses, it's written, they were as convincing as church bells saying the day is Sunday. The priests, confident that they're about to take charge of a saint, ordered the Te Deum sung at St. Louis' arrival. Can you imagine that after being kicked out, losing his place in seminary, he's being welcomed back, and the seminary is actually singing hymns at his arrival. He was at last in the Holy of Holies, created by his hero, Father Oyer, the devoted slave of Mary, and he was at last on the direct road to the altar of Mary's son to become a priest. The Sulpicians might well have asked for mercy, because the next 5 years were going to be hard on them. St. Louis was going to be sort of a burden on them. He seemed to live on top of a mountain they could not climb, to breathe an air too rarefied for them to inhale. They weren't sure if he was a saint or a fool pretending to be a saint. And this is more the seminarians, not the head of the seminary, but they would laugh at St. Louis when he would talk about Mary. The other seminarians would much prefer to talk about the goings-on of court at Versailles with the King of France. So maybe a note on why and how it's not theologically wrong. It's not that St. Louis de Montfort didn't love Christ. Maybe a note on his love for the Virgin Mary. De Montfort's love for Mary was unique and extraordinary. No man of his era was so openly, so completely, so ardently hers. No one had such a childlike trust in her. Few men of any age had given themselves so fully into her guidance. But not even those closest to him knew or suspected that he loved God far more than he loved the Virgin. They had no idea that the principal reason he loved Mary was that she brought him closer and ever closer to eternal wisdom. That was always his North Star, was eternal wisdom, his description for God. The other students at Saint-Sulpice, they had great wonder for the Incarnation, but that doesn't mean that they understood intellectually the importance of the Blessed Mother, even though they understood the importance of what happened within her. The dust of the Jansenist heresy had stung their eyes and coated their mouths. They could not see the doctrine clearly, and they had quit discussing it seriously. Talk of the Virgin Mother had become old-fashioned, bad form, infantile goo. They had no idea that devotion to Mary was a prelude to devotion to God. To Louis, it was simple. One of the things you'll see in true devotion, what I'm about to read, is a quote from Wisdom's Fool, is how St. Louis and those before him saw the Blessed Mother as the new Eden. Mary was to St. Louis not only the gate to the way to paradise, she was an earthly paradise herself, the true paradise of the new Adam, filled with untold riches, with beauty, with delights, with all sorts of good things the new Adam left there. In this Eden, he wrote, this weedless garden, one may find trees which were planted by God and maintained by his grace. There is the tree of life, which bore Jesus as its fruit, and note in the Hail Mary, we say, blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. St. Elizabeth's words, but St. Louis de Montfort is where I learned that Jesus is the fruit of the Virgin Mary. Realize that. So that means that the new tree of life is Mary. The new fruit of the tree of life is the Eucharist, which is Jesus. And that's why she is the fruit. That's why he is the fruit of her womb. And there is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, whose fruit was incarnate wisdom, the light of the world. There are in this most beautiful place flowers of virtue whose fragrance thrills the angels. There are fields of flowers, meadows of hope, towers of strength, and mansions of simplicity. The air is pure. Day reigns here, day without night. A beautiful day, the day of the sacred humanity. The sun does not cast a shadow. It is the sun of the divinity. The Holy Spirit speaks of Mary as the sanctuary of the divinity, the resting place of the Trinity, the throne of God, the city of God, the altar of God, the temple of God, and the world of God. So St. Louis at Saint-Sulpice is going to be somewhat rewarded for his otherness. Father Brenier is going to appoint him as the librarian of the seminary, put him in charge of Mary's little chapel in the seminary, make him master of ceremonies for all the liturgies there. Now, Louis now had a shrine where he alone could be when he had no other duties. He had all the books he'd ever wanted to read, books about wisdom, books about the cross, books about the rosary, books about the slavery to Mary. Father Boudon's book, Holy Slavery of the Admirable Mother of God, to show you where this is all coming from. Father Oyer, who had founded the Seminary of Saint-Sulpice, meant for it to be a little kingdom of Our Lady. and he had put a silver chain around his neck in token of this slavery. And that's St. Louis is going to talk about wearing this chain when you make the consecration to Mary to Jesus through Mary as a sign of this slavery, of these holy bonds. Father Oyer, the Mother of God, is said to have appeared to him while in the Church of Notre Dame and to have given him the plans for the seminary. While the building was nearing completion, Father Oyer carried its keys all the way to the shrine of Our Lady of Chartres. There he begged the lady to take possession of his house and bless it forevermore. He spoke of his own consecration, Father Oyer did, and when I say Father Oyer, that's how I'm pronouncing Olier, Father Oyer. He spoke of his own consecration to the Blessed Mother. As her slave, he wrote, I owe the happiness and glory of my bond service to Jesus Christ, to that which I vowed to the Virgin Mary, for that incomparable mistress draws all souls first to her own love and service, in order to lead them afterwards to Jesus Christ our Lord. The great aim of the mother being the honor of her son. That is what she meant by her words, the marriage feast at Cana. Whatsoever he shall say unto you, do ye. Do whatever he tells you. So this is what leads St. Louis ultimately to make his first real consecration to the Blessed Mother. When he had absorbed all that had been written and was in this library about this holy slavery, he consecrated himself solemnly to Jesus in Mary and through Mary, and gave up to him and to her everything he owned, everything he had, even the value of his prayers and his good works. That's everything that the slave does is for the benefit, is owned by his work, his merits are all owned by his master, his mistress. That's one of the key features of spirituality of the consecration, is that just like the Blessed Mother, who never counted any of her merits to her credit, she never counted them at all for herself. That's why Father Ripperger will say that the demons just hate her. She never counted any of it for herself. When you become a slave to Mary through this consecration, you no longer get to count any of your merits for yourself. They all go to her. And this is more than fair, because when they go to her, she multiplies them. She is the Lady of the Magnificat, the magnification. She multiplies. So, if you get merit for saying one rosary, when you're consecrated to Blessed Mother and your merit goes to her, it multiplies. And so that's really cool. So to finish that quote, everything he owned, everything he had, even the value of his prayers and his good works, he gave himself first entirely to Mary, believing that the more truly a soul is consecrated to her, the more truly it is consecrated to her Son. This is what he means by true devotion to Mary. That's the encapsulation of that whole understanding. He was given permission to spread this devotion, this true devotion, and even start a group in the seminary. Now, we enter into this, St. Louis enters into the orbit of an interesting figure. It's Madame de Montespan. So her name is Athénée de Montespan. She's a daughter of a duke. She meets the king when she was chosen the maid of honor to his queen, Maria Theresa. So this is King Louis XIV, the enlightened despot, one of the greatest quote unquote kings of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in all of Europe at this time. Not exactly good for the people, not great for the church necessarily either. So Athénée de Montespan was maid of honor to King Louis XIV's queen, Maria Theresa. 2 years later, she was married off to the Marquess de Montespan, the Marquis de Montespan. She was the mother of 2 children when the king decided that she should belong to him alone. So the king, just kind of like King David, just took this woman. Her husband was helpless against his master's majesty. He protested by draping his coach with black and decorating it with antlers, then driving it to the palace of Versailles so that everyone could see how he did not believe in the divine right of kings, and he was protesting this decision of the king to take his wife, as well he should. So King Louis XIV, as you might guess, didn't appreciate this kind of criticism, so he had the Marquis, jailed and exiled him to his estates in the Caribbean. The Madame de Montespan mistress now of King Louis XIV, is going to outshine every other woman, including Louis's wife in the court, and she is going to have huge sway over the governance of France, and no one's going to be able to touch her. At her word, men will be jailed, beaten, taken from office, made kings, made bishops, just a huge amount of power. And she wields all this up until the point when she doesn't. And there's this thing called the affair of the poisons, of the poisons, affaire des poisons. She realizes that she's losing the king's affection and his love for her, so she attempts to win him back by desperate and devious methods, which lead to a belief that she's a sorceress, a witch, a user of love charms that might poison the king or make him her slave for life. But even in her gayest and most lavish days, she wasn't a queen. She was still just a mistress, and she was called the humiliation of France. Now she is the disgrace of France. She hid herself. She could not sleep at night. She was afraid there were people she had ruined by a word, a look, a bit of sarcasm or satire. She had been jailed, exiled, beaten, degraded. Any one of them might find his way to her bed at night to kill her. So St. Louis de Montfort is going to be ordained in 1700. That's an easy date to remember. And that's just either right before or right after he meets Madame de Montespan. He goes to her to plead for his sister, Louis's sister, to ask her favor that his sister can ultimately be named to a good abbey, even though they're penniless, without buying a dowry. So there's this dramatic encounter between France's greatest sinner and France's greatest saint, at least for their time. Athénée must have found Louis the most exciting man she ever met, more exciting even than her other Louis, King Louis. It's an interesting comparison between the two Louis in her life. This one wanted nothing for himself, only a pittance for his sister. He didn't pity her. St. Louis didn't pity her. He didn't scorn her. He didn't flatter her. And there must have been something in his eyes to show her how much he admired her in her role as a penitent. After her great humiliation and shame, she converts, has a pretty strong conversion, and tries to make up for what she's done. By this time, her hair had turned white, her face had softened, her tongue had lost its bite. To Louis, she was more beautiful than ever. It is impossible to believe Louis did not see her beauty or that he did not enjoy it. It is impossible to believe he stood before her looking only at her shoes or his own, as one of his biographers pictures him. He must have seen instantly that she was a friend and undoubtedly the one ordained to help him bear his cross. So the Madame de Montespan agrees to care not only for Louise, but also for two of St. Louis' other sisters. She made provision for Louise to enter the convent of St. Joseph in Paris, and Sylvie, another one of his sisters, she placed in the royal abbey of might be struggling. I'm going to mention this is a really important abbey. I might be struggling with pronunciation for a while because it's got a VR in there. Fontevraud. I'll do my best. So it was called the queen of all the abbeys in France. The abbess was called a queen abbess because she was usually of royal blood. Henry II's Aunt Matilda had been abbess there, married Queen of Scots' sister. This abbey pretty much only took its orders from the Pope. The bodies of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, King John, like the Magna Carta, all are buried here. Those are all English kings, but from French lines. So it's not odd. I think it is kind of a sad thing that ultimately this historic abbey becomes a prison for those awaiting the guillotine. To this point, after this was a little out of order, but right before his ordination, he is given the honor of walking to Chartres Cathedral with another seminarian who ultimately becomes like a bishop or something. And that other seminarian notices him frozen but in prayer. After that long journey, he kneels before the statue in Chartres Cathedral of the Blessed Mother and is frozen there in prayer. He spent pretty much the whole of the next day unmoving, kneeling before this statue. So he's ordained St. Louis is ordained on June the 5th, 1700. That's the Ember Saturday after Pentecost. So typically then and even now ordained on Ember Days. Ember Days were something that was sort of forgotten about in the implementation of Vatican II. They just weren't assigned to a committee, but they're still very important days. And there's even a rhyme for them, Lenti, Pinti, Cruci, Luci, that Ember Days or days of fasting that kind of correspond with the harvest when you would burn the crops or burn the stubble. So Lent, do you have them during Lent? Around Pentecost, that's usually when we ordain priests. Lenti, Pinti, Cruci, Luci. So I think it's the exaltation of the cross, the Cruci, and Lucy, the Feast of St. Lucy. They fall 4 times during the year, pretty much in each season. So St. Louis is ordained on one of these Ember Days, the one near Pentecost. It's strange, he didn't immediately receive after ordination his priestly faculty, so he's not able to hear confessions for a little time. He's still dreaming at this point that he gets sent to Canada to convert the Iroquois Indians, the Native Americans and North America. But it's when he says that to his superior, he's laughed at and denied that. But Saint-Sulpice is now finally done with this priest that they didn't really know what to do with. And maybe they even sang the Te Deum on his way out as well. He walks now to Fontevraud, but refuses to identify himself. This is something you're going to see him do multiple times. He's going to test wherever he's visiting or going, wherever his destination is, even if he's walked 1,000 miles to get there, he's going to test the charity of his destination by presenting himself anonymously and asking just for the charity of Christ. That he's testing to see if they're going to treat him like Christ, if they're going to be true Christians that look on the poorest of the poor as Christ himself, because St. Louis is always going to look like the poorest of the poor. So he walks to Fontevraud, but refuses to identifying himself instead with the poor. The portress, that's the female version of a porter, the person who watches the door of the monastery. So a lot of great saints that were porters, like Andre Basset in Canada, Saint Alphonsus Rodriguez. There's a great poem that Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote about him. So porter it's one of the lowliest offices in the monastery and in abbey, but because of the great humility that comes with that, there have been some really saintly figures that have been porters. Anyway, St. Louis exasperates the portress of Fontevraud. So she's so upset with him that she calls the Queen Abbess to the door to speak with St. Louis. And she also rejects St. Louis, not knowing who he is, and this man refusing to identify himself except as a poor beggar. So Louis leaves the abbey, and the nuns he creates kind of a stir in the abbey, and they couldn't stop talking about him, how big he was, how wretched and lean, how ragged, how covered with dust, how bold and stubborn. And they talked of how he kept saying, charity for the love of God. That's all he would say when he presented himself at the door, the closed door of the abbey. Charity for the love of God. When the portress described him as very tall and strong, with a great nose and an obstinate chin and eyes that disturbed her terribly for no reason at all, Sylvie Grignon, right, St. Louis' sister that the Madame de Montespan had placed in this abbey out of generosity, Sylvie recognizes exactly who this person is, and it's her brother. Sylvie Grignon cries out that must have been her newly ordained brother come to visit her. So this revelation causes great consternation in the abbey, even panic, because Sylvie was this protege now of Madame de Montespan, and her brother Louis was the pet saint of this penitent mother of the royal children. That references Madame de Montespan, even though she had been humiliated and kind of cast out of the court, her children are still the main heirs of King Louis, because by royal decree, King Louis and Madame de Montespan's illegitimate children, by royal decree, were made legitimate children of King Louis. So these are now some of the most powerful royals in all of France. The penitent mother of the royal children has great power, especially over the Abbey of Fontevraud. So the abbey realized they had actually ousted a priest who had begged shelter for the love of God, and not only a priest, but a most influential one, even a bishop, if Montespan were to snap her fingers. They now must kneel humbly at his feet, beg his forgiveness. He must have the best food in the larder, the best wine the cellar boasts. He must have the softest bed, the most comfortable pillow. Look for him in the village, search every house. Now, clearly, he's not going to want these things, but Sylvie tells him exactly where they're going to find him. Go to the poorest house first. If the man is my brother, you will find him there. So servants of the abbey went to the poorest house, found him, but he refused to return to the abbey. And he says, St. Louis says, tell the Lady Abbess that I cannot accept for myself the charity she denied for the love of God. And like I say, he's going to do this multiple times in his life, and it's just it's trademark Louis de Montfort, but it's also really cool. So he's still struggling to find his place in the world. And he's eventually going to reach Nantes, like the Edict of Nantes that dealt with the Huguenots, the French Protestants. So this area is going to be a mission territory of France. It's a problematic area, and I think this area includes the Vendée, which is going to be very important later on. Some people say Nantes, Nantes, but it's not. He becomes part of the community of Saint Clement there, which he had hoped to be this great place of saints, but it wasn't. It was just young priests and seminarians that were real full of themselves, like a country club of privileged priests, jeweled snuff boxes. Some even wore swords. Few went to communion. And you know how St. Louis, who had the family rank sufficient to wear a sword, he refused to wear a sword, and here are these guys wearing swords. So he eventually asked to be released from this place, and the Madame de Montespan invites him to the Abbey of Fontevraud to witness the clothing ceremonies of his sister, Sylvie. So when she takes simple vows, she receives different garments as a nun. Nuns don't all wear the same thing. You can look at each nun and see at which stage they are and becoming fully professed members of their order based on the color and styling of the headpiece, the wimple, the habit. So she's taking her simple vows and she's receiving maybe a new habit or something. There, St. Louis has a chance to talk to the Madame de Montespan. She offers him a canonry, to become a canon of something, maybe like a great cathedral where he would receive an income, and he declines because he wants poverty. So instead, she's going to connect him with the Bishop of Poitiers. So Poitiers, from history, you might remember it as an English victory. During the Battle of Poitiers, an English victory during the 100 Years' War. I think it's also either the other name for the Battle of Tours back in the 700s, Charles Martel, or a related battle to Tours. So, important region of France. The Bishop of Poitiers is a friend of the Madame de Montespan, received his office from her, and St. Louis is going to walk 70 miles to see this bishop and hopefully do good work under this bishop. But before he leaves, he celebrates Mass in Montespan's chapel at Fontevraud, and he performs a miracle there. The people that talk about this miracle were only talking about it because they thought it should be attributed to the Madame de Montespan, and not St. Louis, but it's St. Louis that the miracle comes through, not the person who purchased the chapel, who decorated the chapel. Maybe both get credit. I don't know. He had just finished Mass on the marble altar that had been donated by the Madame de Montespan, was about to leave the chapel when he saw a blind man. He was inspired to ask him by the Holy Spirit if he wanted to see. The man, puzzled as well as startled, said of course he wanted to see. Louis put his wet fingers on the sightless eyes, and immediately the man saw. So St. Louis' life, during his life, a lot of miracles are going to come through him, not just of conversions, but of healing. So St. Louis walks to Poitiers, 70 miles, which is not really that much for St. Louis. And while waiting for him there, he's going to go to a hospital, to serve at a hospital, and this hospital is going to be kind of a major part of his life. While he's there at the hospital, the authorities of the hospital, in the name of all the people there, present a petition to the bishop's brother, Father de Bournat, asking St. Louis to be their priest. But they have to wait for the bishop's return to see if he'll grant that request, if he could be appointed to the hospital. So he's told to hike back to Nantes, where a tremendous surprise awaited him. A day or so after he arrived, all the rights and privileges that he had requested, like to hear confessions, were given to him, and he was sent to preach a mission there in the little town of Grand Champ. So finally, St. Louis gets to become a missionary priest. His first mission town is Grand Champ. Does some good work there, and the bishop calls him back to return to the hospital. Now, what's interesting is that the bishop of Poitiers, he goes from Nantes, Poitiers to Nantes, back to Poitiers. It's a lot of traveling. I'll try and make it as understandable as possible. I'm going to try and construct a little map of St. Louis' life, because for this pilgrimage we're going to undertake all the different we're going to try and go to all the different locations of St. Louis' life, to Nantes, to Vendée, to Rennes, to Paris, to Saint-Sulpice, to Mont Saint-Michel. So I'd like to, when I lead this pilgrimage, be able to tell people exactly what happened where. It's going to take, I'm still struggling to figure out the timeline. Anyway, he's back in Poitiers. The bishop of Poitiers had actually met St. Louis before, back when he was Father Gerard, when the bishop was just a priest. And he was the tutor to the children of King Louis and King Louis's mistress, the Madame de Montespan. That's how this bishop came under the patronage of the Madame de Montespan. He was her children's tutor. So it was this man, Father Gerard, now Bishop Gerard, who had sent Louis to Madame de Montespan in the first place on behalf of Louis's sister, Louise. Apparently the bishop had forgotten all this. And how could you forget somebody like Louis, who's so big and burly and ragged? Anyway, so it goes. So now this bishop has called him back to the hospital in Poitiers, this general hospital. At this point, Louis asks his spiritual director, Father Le Chassier, for advice with all his penances. He's sleeping on straw, takes no breakfast, eats basically nothing until dinner. Was he right in doing all this? He was in good health. He might take the discipline every week, besides the 3 ordinary ones, meaning whipping himself, wearing a girdle of horsehair once or twice a week. And Father Le Chassier just can't take any more of this. I don't know if he feels inferior to his spiritual directee. He's not going to be responsible for penances that might or might not make Louis a saint, nor is he going to be responsible for forbidding him these penances. He told Louis to get another spiritual director. I shall always be, he finished his letter, with the same esteem and the same affection, devotedly yours. But the next time that Louis is going to see Father Le Chassier, a little foreshadowing, he is neither going to be affectionate nor devoted. So it's at this point that storm clouds begin to gather in Louis's life. So where we left off, Louis has been sent by Madame de Montespan to the Bishop of Poitiers. Bishop of Poitiers was actually the one who had first sent Louis to the Madame de Montespan. He forgot all that. Louis had, while waiting for the bishop, volunteered at a hospital there in Poitiers. Pretty rough hospitals we're going to talk about in a second. And the hospital asked that Louis be appointed as their head, basically their chaplain. The bishop grants this request, and now it's a blessing and a curse that Louis is going to do great things at this hospital, but when you do great things, no good deed goes unpunished. So Louis knew that in accepting the management of the general hospital, he was accepting a heavy cross. He had no idea how heavy it was. He soon began to call it Babylon. Babylon the wicked, Babylon the cursed. It was a pitiless place, and it had a pitiless system. Pitiless, I should say. The strong fed on the weak debauched themselves to lessen their miseries. They suffered from their ills, their wounds, their wretched surroundings, and from the treatment of those paid to care for and protect them. They wandered into town when they could and begged or stole money for their drunken orgies, and some lived in scandalous conditions. I think if you've been listening to this podcast, this might remind you of the orphanage in Busan, South Korea, that Father Aloysius Schwartz tried to rescue children from, that the people in the orphanage, instead of, this is in Venerable Aloysius Schwartz's story, instead of the meat, the government of South Korea would send meat to the orphanage, instead of it going to the kids, it it would be sold off by the people that ran the orphanage. It was run by a gang of lepers that and other bad folks that would sexually assault the children. The children would wander out like zombies. Every time they killed off a couple kids in this orphanage, they would bury the bodies and conceal the burial site with a pine tree. So the back of the orphanage was just a pine tree forest. Is terrible. And so that reminds me of this general hospital that St. Louis is asked to administer and reform. So, a little bit more on how bad it is. The staff ate regular meals in the refectory. The patients ate alone and often only on bread 2 or 3 days old issued in the morning. If the management had chickens for dinner, the patients might be offered the bones in warm water with perhaps a small chicken feather in each bowl to make it a festive affair. Sometimes a man known to have gone into the city the day before was denied his daily ration because he had come too early or too late until he surrendered the coppers hidden in his poisonously dirty pockets. Many people, civic authorities among them, came to see the amazing reforms in the wicked Babylon. So, it didn't take Louis long to restore some of the dignity to the patients there. They noted that St. Louis served at the table while someone read from the gospel of the day or from some other holy book. St. Louis ate with the poor, and he only ate the food that the poor were given, and he helped beg for food for them. He also slept in the same rooms as the patients. The rooms intended only for contagious patients. He would sleep in the worst of the rooms. And they took no pay from the city for all his work, and that besides managing the place, he also swept the floors, washed dishes, and even scoured bedpans. Like, there was no job too humble for St. Louis. I mean, just there. Like, if you were to die just there, that would put his rank of holiness would match with Mother Teresa, St. Aloysius Gonzaga. I think I have the right saint who ministered to the plague victims in Rome, but he's gone to go on to do so much more, both in writing and missionary work. It's just a remarkable life. It's almost like he's one of the greats. So because of all this good work he's doing, 2 of the hospital leaders, including the superioress, female version of superior, harshly opposed him for all this good work. And he went on retreat and just gave the matter to Jesus and Mary. And here's another sort of thing that's going to happen a lot in Louis' life. It's going to be sort of a holy curse to oppose. It's not that he's going to curse people, but if they oppose him, they bring a curse on themselves. So in the face of the opposition he's getting for doing good work and overcoming the evils that the superioress was forcing upon the hospital, he's going to just go on retreat. Just take a moment, and he's going to give the matter entirely to Jesus and Mary. And within weeks, both of the people that were opposing him, the leaders of the hospital, the other leaders of the hospital, are dead. That's what happens often to those who oppose the holy will of St. Louis in his life. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last, that God clears St. Louis' path. There still remained one woman, or at least another woman that opposed him, and she was the proudest woman Louis had ever known. Louis has no trouble fighting the devil. They hear him like they hear Padre Pio or St. Ignatius fighting the devil. But Louis never underestimated the power of a woman, for evil or for good. We have this terrible woman versus Madame de Montespan, who was a terrible woman and became a great woman. He was afraid of this woman. He feared her more than he feared the devil. He at least knew how to handle the devil. The young woman worked by day and by night to oppose him, to league the inmates against him, make them mutiny, make the insane attack him physically, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The drunkards insist on drinking what they could and when they could. A young woman also aroused the parish priests in the city against St. Louis de Montfort to such an extent that they all started complaining about him to the Bishop of Poitiers. She would say that St. Louis had said this or that about the priests, which, because St. Louis has some esteem right now, she's going to use that against him and make him sound like he's this horribly prideful person and tell lies about what St. Louis said about these priests and called them dirty names. She kept the doctors and nurses, most of the attendants, in a constant state of hostility. So, in the midst of this, St. Louis is going to start forming one of his orders, the Daughters of Wisdom. He's going to put together 20 women who were many people would laugh at. He put together Poor Wisps of Womanhood, it was called, that comically were led by the blind, their superior was a blind woman. Into this mix of wonderful, holy wisps of womanhood is going to come Marie-Louise Trichet. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a crown lawyer, and the darling of a rich and important Poitiers family. She was beautiful, holy, full of life, and the saint asked her to join his group of lay apostles. This results in huge objections from her family, who are eventually going to complain to the bishop. She came into Babylon not as a pauper. How could she be a pauper when her family is so comfortable and rich? But as an assistant to the head nurse. She worked from 4 o'clock in the morning until 10 or 11 at night, lived on the poor food that St. Louis did, lived with the sick and the degraded and the insane and the helpless and the despairing and the dying poor. And she gave strict obedience to her blind superior. De Montfort tested her virtues in many ways. He was sure this bud would blossom into a lily that would perfume the world. So not much longer, even though her family could afford for her to become a nun and receive her habit, they wait for the providence of God to supply the funds for Marie-Louise Trichet to receive her habit. But not long after that, Louis is going to be kicked out of the hospital because Trichet's mother is going to complain to the bishop about all the different things that Louis is making her do, carry all this really tough work that is helping Trichet grow in holiness, but her mother is appalled by. So there are a lot of crosses being heaped on St. Louis at this point. There's a great quote on this. Why is it that the most faithful slaves of Jesus and Mary are the most despised of men? It is because these slaves, being her favorites, receive from her heaven's best favors, best graces, which are crosses. And I maintain it is the slaves of Mary who carry these crosses with more ease, more merit, and more glory. I think those are St. Louis' own words. And in a letter to Sister Marie-Louise Trichet, he's going to ask her to pray that his crosses are doubled and increased. If you are asking utter poverty for me, humiliations, abasement, a heavier cross. He begged her to gather some good souls, good friends around her, and asked them to pray for him and to pray with them every Monday between 1 and 2 o'clock. Marie-Louise found 60 women to join her in her prayers. One of these was Catherine Brunet, who would become the second daughter of wisdom, the second permanent. The 30 women he had gathered were kind of lay apostles. Marie-Louise Trichet is the first true member of the order, and Catherine Brunet is going to be the second. St. Louis says, let them calumniate me, jeer at me, tear my good name to pieces, put me in prison. How precious are such gifts. These are all crosses to him, and they're all precious to him because they allow him to follow Christ, Beatitudes, path of Beatitudes, imitate Christ, as they mocked Christ, let them mock him. They are gifts to him. When Marie-Louise was about to receive her habit, she fell sick. And devil was trying to convince her that this was going to prevent her from receiving her habit. She was afraid that she would not live to take her vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. And St. Louis wrote, I rejoice to hear of the sickness which God in his kindness has sent to purify you like gold in the fire. You victim sacrificed on the altar of the King of Kings to his eternal glory. How high a destiny, how sublime a calling. I almost envy your happiness. Have no fear of the evil spirit who will try to make you believe you'll never be professed. Let your body suffer, but let your heart rejoice, for nothing is better for you at the present time than sickness. How opposite this is to the prosperity gospel of Joel Osteen and others, right? You follow the cross of Christ. You don't do this to receive riches, right? Material riches, gold. You follow Christ to receive spiritual riches, which you will surely receive. And those may be painful. It may be sickness. St. Louis teaches us that better than almost anyone. At this point, the hospital is begging. The hospital at Poitiers is begging for Louis to return. They send this letter to the bishop through St. Louis' spiritual director, Father Le Chassier, only this isn't his spiritual director anymore, but a man that's tried to reject Louis, doesn't want to be a spiritual director anymore. So you can kind of see the crow that his Father Le Chassier, his former spiritual director, has to eat to present this letter to the bishop. Again, St. Louis is welcomed grandly, like when they sing the Te Deum at this Saint-Sulpice. And almost as quickly, he is exiled again. There was dancing in the streets when he came back to the hospital. They lit bonfires, they held a wild festival, and almost as soon as the bonfires are spent, he's out again. One of the reasons that he gets in trouble is he hears a military officer swearing at his men. And St. Louis is so outraged at the colonel's profanity and his wickedly irreverent use of the name of God that he forced him to kneel in the street and beg God's pardon while his men looked on and laughed at him and cheered. Whether the force Louis used to accomplish this was mystical or muscular, none of his biographers seem to know. This colonel becomes the priest's enemy for life and the cause of some of his suffering. So Louis knows he's about to be kicked out of the hospital again because he's doing good, and good is going to be rewarded with pain. He asks the bishop to let him resign before they force him out. Louis says to the bishop, "Let me be a missionary in this diocese, going from parish to parish wherever you may need me, preaching missions, giving retreats, teaching catechism, hearing confessions, looking after the poor in every way I can." The bishop asks, "How will you live?" Asking, what's going to be the cost of this for him. And Louis says, "God, who feeds the swallows, will provide for me. I do not want any money. I do not want any certain place to live. I shall go where I'm most needed, do what God wants me to do, and perhaps build up some of the old and ruined churches I have seen here and there." So, this is a freebie for the bishop. Like, just let him be, let him do God's work, and he's going to rebuild churches in the diocese that are going to be fruitful and productive, not just of souls, but of revenue for bishops that think too much of that. The bishop responds, "You sound like St. Francis of Assisi. Isn't that rather out of date?" And St. Louis responds, "St. Francis will never be out of date. There will always be men to follow where he led." "All right," the bishop finally assents. "Do as God directs you, but you must have a headquarters. For this I give you the chapel and the house of the penitents. And for your first mission, I give you Montbernage." So Montbernage is going to be one of his second major mission spots. So in this place, all the people are initially afraid to go to him for confession because he's kind of a scary looking guy, a big burly guy. Such a great ruffian of a priest would most certainly punish sinners like themselves. Well, let's find out. Let's see how tough he is. He can't put us in jail. So they go to him for confession, and they are stunned by his gentleness. I've heard this before when I was a young man. I forget the name of the priest that was our parish priest in Edmond, Oklahoma. And he said that a priest must be a lion in the pulpit and a lamb in the confessional. And St. Louis did exactly that. They were stunned by his gentleness. They were softened. They were changed. All their sins had been forgiven, every one of them. They're supposed to not even remember them, even the worst of them. Like, people were watching people go to confession, and they couldn't believe who was coming out of this, and that the priest was even being gracious to them. Such things had never been heard of in Montbernage. The miracle of it shook the district to its roots and sent the devil howling in protest back to hell. St. Louis would say, "If I'm too lenient with sinners, I will gladly suffer for it in purgatory. I would rather suffer thus than be harsh with them or sparing of God's infinite mercy." He gets in trouble again because there's a group of kids making lewd gestures at women doing their laundry in the river, and one of their mothers complained to the bishop of Poitiers, that St. Louis struck her child, whipped him for speaking lewdly, and her little angel would never do anything like that. And so the bishop bars Louis from saying mass in his diocese. I think the bishop recants this, though his patience is growing thin with Louis. The bishop of Poitiers is going to have a lot of Jansenist friends that hate what Louis is doing, that are not about the mercy of God, but more about the justice of God. St. Louis is going to be kind of a forerunner of the divine mercy that St. Faustina is going to talk about. He's really making the Jansenists upset, so he's every time he does something like this, it's going to add more arrows to the quivers of the Jansenists, and the Bishop of Poitiers is eventually going to kick him out. In the meantime, this is interesting. It's a kind of a formula for his mission, for his parish missions at this time. He would thoroughly prepare the congregation. He created a church like out of a barn. Because that was the best there was in this area. It was a rough area. He began the mission in earnest, preaching several times a day, hearing many confessions, marshaling many parades and processions. He had painted banners for each of the 15 mysteries of the Rosary, and the boys who carried these felt highly honored. Great time to talk about well-done liturgy. Dignified processions are a great way to create vocations among boys and men. There were days devoted to general communions, one when all the men went to the altar rail together, another devoted entirely to giving the host to the women, and a day set apart for the children. So on different days, different groups would receive Holy Communion, prepare for Holy Communion, go to confession, properly receive Holy Communion. There was a day devoted to prayer for the dead and the dying, a day for renewal of baptismal vows, and a day for the planting of a big cross. Seems like this would be the epiphany, the climax of the mission would be creating a Calvary. He did this often wherever he went. Eventually, he's going to create a mountainous Calvary, but that's down the road. Plant a big cross, which should remain as long as possible to remind people that they had given themselves to Jesus, who had given himself to them. When the mission began, everybody in Montbernage had a rosary and wore it openly. So, at least according to St. Louis and the times he's in, wearing a rosary around the neck as like a chine, signifying devotion and bondage, holy slavery, wearing a rosary was not looked down on. It was even seen as holy practice. If people ask you about wearing rosaries, it was not always considered improper. So when the mission began, everybody in Montbernage had a rosary and wore it openly. After the mission, everybody was eager to kiss the statue of Our Lady, which de Montfort held out to them, and most of them repeated after him. So here's a short form of the consecration formula. I give myself wholly to Jesus Christ by the hands of Mary to carry my cross after him all the days of my life. Then there be some public acts of reparation. St. Louis always did this in every other mission. There'd be public reparation to the Blessed Sacrament with a rope around his neck and a torch in his hand. So what was the effect of all this? In Montbernage, he left a lasting devotion to the Rosary. In other communities, it would result in lasting devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, perpetual adoration. He'd said perpetual adoration, but there were always a ton of pious confraternities and congregations established in his wake. Vendée, in the Vendée region specifically, when at the end of the century, the woes foretold by de Montfort fell on France, the Vendéans marched to battle in defense of the altar and the throne with rosaries around their necks or arms or fastened to their belts, and in groups or in common they recited the rosary which Louis had taught their fathers to value and to love. So it's going to be a century of impact, and even to this day, from what St. Louis will do in these missions. The Jansenists are not happy. They are not happy of all the success that St. Louis is having in Montbernage, and they are doubling and tripling their attacks on him. But at the bishop's request, he's still going from town to town repairing churches, and they're grinding their teeth in helplessness. Here was an oafish priest exalting Mary with old-fashioned methods, exalting the one they hated the most, and driving the people to frequent communion, which was strictly against their rules. He was making the Jansenists look foolish, and all because a silly old bishop believed in him. One of the things St. Louis, there's all these books, like pornographic materials circulating through France at this time, some by like legitimate authors. And so St. Louis is going to gather all these into a big pile at one point, and plans to have a bonfire, dirty pictures, dirty books. But the Jansenists somehow stop him from doing this. They get the bishop to side with them. Even though the bishop is on St. Louis' side, somehow they convince him to side with them. The bonfire is called off, and all this pile of books are snatched up by all the little kids in the town that St. Louis had been trying to protect, and all these dirty books and pictures are put back into circulation. So it's just such a frustrating thing for us to talk about, and even especially for St. Louis. He cries out, "Why have they not taken away my life rather than poison so many of these, my little ones? If I could buy back those evil books and pictures by shedding my blood, I would shed every drop of it." He's now, part of his story ends with him being exiled from the diocese of Poitiers by the bishop, and he's going to journey to Rome.